Hello and good afternoon. We are Soumyajit and Manas, and we are going to present our work on player skills of receiving and turning with the ball under pressure. And we have used StatsBomb's 360 data for our project. Who are we? So here are a few words about us. So I am currently a physics PhD student, and Manas works at Gartner, which is an information services firm. We have both been delving into football data analysis at an amateur level fairly recently over the last couple of years. And we regularly post tidbits online. So if you want to check out our work, here are some links. So StatsBomb 360 data gives us a lot of new opportunities to measure a lot of new on and off ball performance metrics because it provides much more context than the usually available event data. So for example, we can study line breaking passes, which Sergio Busquets is a master of and is showing off in the clip at the top. Or we can study things like turning with the ball to receive while receiving to evade pressure, which is being shown by Frankie de Jong in the clip underneath. So here we have chosen to focus on the second case, which is receiving and turning under pressure. And here is one more example being demonstrated by Frankie de Jong. So he receives the pass that comes from the back and then turns, beats his defender, and then passes forward. Here's a brief overview of our content. So we're going to introduce the topic. We're going to talk about something called relative movement sonars. We're going to quantify this skill by certain metrics, some of which are already known to the analytics world and some of which hopefully will be new. We'll briefly mention a few possible actionable points, and then we'll mention a few future direction this work could proceed in. All right, so we have chosen to focus on very specific kinds of sequences, or rather sub-sequences of a position sequence. So these involve a pass followed by another pass, or a pass followed by a carry. So, and the focus of the spotlight is on the receiver of the first pass. So the first pass is shown here in the two examples in yellow. So here and here. And then upon receiving, the player can choose to pass the ball to someone else in red here, or can turn with the ball and carry the ball before performing something else, which is shown in the second example. Now, in the absence of body pose data, it is really difficult to say whether the player actually turned or not. So what we are really using is a proxy for turning by looking at the angle between the two actions. And we also are going to focus on combinations where the first pass is received from the back. So here is the description of the setup we have. So first we have a zone on the field where the action is taking place, where the first pass is being received. After that, we define an angular spread that gives us a definition of what back is. So if the receiver is located here, then any pass that goes through this shaded cone is going to define our choice of what a back pass is. And then here are certain examples of receiving passes from the back for a particular player. But of course, we don't have to restrict ourselves to that particular zone. We can change the zone to the entire pitch if we want to. We can reduce the y-axis, we can reduce the x-axis, and then we can also change the angular zone. All of that is being shown in this small clip. So we can make our actions more restrictive in whichever sense we want. All right. Having described this setup, we'll talk about our first quantifications, which is relative sonars. So before that, I just want to briefly mention what a normal passing sonar looks like. So normal passing sonars are polar or angular histogram of passes. So take this example here. So we have Ben Chilwell running down the left flank and passing either to the midfield or to the forwards or to the center backs. And we have quite a few of these front passes and then quite a few of these back diagonal passes. And then the longest passes are the sideways passes. This is succinctly shown in this passing sonar. So we have the highest frequency of forward or backward diagonal passes is shown here. And then the longest passes, which are the sideways passes, shown here. So the color indicates the frequency of passing and the length indicates the median length of the passes in those directions. Relative sonar does something very similar. So the concept was introduced originally by John Mueller in one of his awesome articles. And in normal passing sonars, we look at the absolute angle of the pass with respect to certain fixed line. So that could be the side line or some horizontal line. The relative sonars use the angle between the two moves. So the first pass received and the second subsequent move. So it's not the conventional angle between two vectors. It's just simply the angle between lines. So that's being shown here in the few examples we have on the right. So here there's a pass that's being received that's literally going straight up, and then the player turns and then progresses the ball straight up again. And so the angle between these two lines is 180 degrees. So that's why we have 180 degrees and vertical progression and turning. The exact same thing happens with this pass as well. This pass is slightly diagonal, but the player once again turns and progresses the ball exactly along that same direction. So once again, the angle between the two lines is 180 degrees, and that's why we have 180 degrees of vertical progression or turning for both these cases. On the contrary, here we have a pass that goes straight up and then comes back pretty much to the same location. There's a slight deviation. And then there's a pass here that goes diagonally up and then comes back pretty much once again in the same direction. And for these cases, it's sending the ball back to where it came from. So we assign it an angle of 0 degrees or 360 degrees, depending on whichever way you want to look at it. So in short, 0 degrees or 360 degrees refer to the ball being sent back to where it came from, and then 180 degrees is vertical ball progression. Vertical in the sense that it maintains the direction of the original pass. So here are a few examples of relative sonars. So here we have two players from Sevilla, Fernando and Ivan Rakitic. And here on the left, we have the combinations that each of these players have performed. So the yellow passes are the first passes that these players receive from someone else in the team. And then the red ones are the movements, either pass or a carry, by which they progress the ball upfield or sideways. And then a visual representation of this in terms of a relative sonar is being shown on the right. So we can see both these players have a high frequency of moving the ball in the direction the original pass came from. So that's why the brightest red color is in the 180 degrees direction. And Rakitic tends to play a lot of long balls as well. Typically, he will receive short passes from Marcus Acuna or Diego Carlos on the left, and then send out long balls to Jesus Navas on the right. So his median length of passes is usually longer. So that's what's being shown in this relative sonars. So this gives us a neat and concise depiction of how players tend to turn with the ball. So this might not or might be indicative of skill. This could also be indicative of tendencies of the players. So we are going to look at a few more metrics to analyze this skill or tendency. So a few questions that we can ask when analyzing this whole thing is, upon receiving the first pass, is the next action successful and at what rate? So the next action is a pass or a carry. So we are asking if the next pass is successful or if the next carry happens without any immediate disposition. Is the subsequent action threatening? If not, is the action after that threatening? How much ball progression happens towards the opposition goal as a result of this action? Unpredictability or predictability, as you wish to interpret this thing. So upon receiving the first pass, does the receiver pass or turn in a very specific way, or is there a lot of variance? Tightness and risk. So how risky is the zone where the action is being performed, and what sort of tight spaces are the actions being performed in? And then we can repeat the measurement of all of these metrics, focusing only on under pressure actions. And then a natural question to ask would be, is the player perturbed or unperturbed by pressure? So measure how much this relative angle distribution changes when pressed as opposed to unpressured. And finally, we have a model which looks at completion of the move above and over expectation. So it's basically an extension of expected pass models, but with passes and carries and using information from the 360 data. A brief mention about the data set itself. So we have been given Bundesliga and La Liga select matches. There are about 540 games in the data set, and the graph that we will be showing in the next few slides will focus mainly on midfielders. So mainly center mids or defensive midfielders, although many of these players have played a variety of roles last season. And there are several players who have played a much more offensive role than traditional CMs or teams. Right, so our very first metric is possibly the simplest thing that we can think of, and that's success rate of these combinations. So on the left-hand side, we have this overall success rate for all such quick combinations that these players have attempted and the overall volume. And on the right-hand side, we have the same graph, but only focusing on the actions performed under pressure. The x-axis gives us the volume of actions. So it goes from at least 100 such actions for the overall case and at least 50 actions when performed under pressure. And then the y-axis gives us combination success percentage. And we have also decided to focus on 10 specific CM, DM, or let's just say midfielders. It's not that these are the only players we could have focused on. There are other good midfielders playing in these leagues as well, but we believe these are some of these most standout names. So we have Frankie de Jong, Florian Wirtz, Luka Modric, Joan Jordan, Pedri, Dani Parejo, Joshua Kimmich, Toni Kroos, Koke, and Sergio Busquets. And we can see that all of these players are really, really good at not only attempting these combinations in volume, but also being successful in attempting these things. And their combination success percentage doesn't really drop even when they're performing these actions under pressure. So they're really good at holding on to the ball. The next measure that we want to look at is direct threat by the subsequent action that these players perform after receiving the first pass. And this is measured by XT, or expected threat. This was a metric that was introduced a couple of years back by Karun Singh. And it essentially looks at how threatening or how dangerous your pass or ball carry can be. So on the example on the left, we have Sergio Busquets receiving a pass from the goalkeeper and then playing a line-splitting pass. So that's a threatening pass because that eliminates several defenders and several opposition players and allows Messi to create something else. And similarly, on the right-hand side, we have Frankie de Jong, who is really well known for his dribbling and ball carrying abilities. So he beats the pressing player on the turn and then carries the ball off it. So both of these actions will get a decent value of expected threat. And so we can aggregate the expected threat value for all such actions and present them as a scatter plot here. We have decided to normalize per 100 such combinations because these players will have played different number of combinations purely due to the fact that they have played different number of matches and different number of minutes. So we have normalized the value per 100 combinations. And once again, we see all of the highlighted names doing pretty well. More offensive-minded players like Florian Wirtz will obviously show up much higher up the graph. But we have all of the other players doing pretty well despite attempting such high volume combinations. And then we can look at the same thing under pressure, and then something interesting happens here. The values under pressure seem to be slightly higher as compared to the overall values. And here are a couple of reasons why this could be happening, but this would obviously require much more detailed investigation. So there's one possibility that the unpressured actions are against set defenses. So it's hard to find a lot of dangerous spaces against set defenses. And hence, these players are attempting a lot of high volume positive actions, but they're mostly short passes or short carries, and then they pass on to someone else. So these do not rack up a lot of XT. On the other hand, under pressure actions could be against unset defenses, and there is more area to exploit. So if you bypass the pressure, there's a lot of space to exploit. And so the unpressured actions could rack up high XT in principle. The second possibility is that the under pressure actions are more of the hit and hope kind. So this is the typical case for most players. When put under pressure, they would just try to launch the ball off field. And if luck permits, then some of these actions will be successful. But even if they're successful, it might not allow further ball progression, as the next action would be under pressure. So if it's an aerial pass, then the receiver would be under immediate pressure from the opposition defender. So there might not be any further progression. The third possibility is that this is just pure noise being picked up due to smaller volume of under pressure events as compared to the overall number of events. So this is something that could be investigated in some future work. The next metric that we look at is threat facilitated. This is typically given by sequences that have an up, back, and through kind of movement. So if you look at the clip here, there's this first pass being played, and then this guy plays a back pass, and then there's this through ball, and that sends an attacker clear. So this player who plays the back pass doesn't rack up a positive XT. His XT value is negative, but he allows the next player to create something by passing in a valuable area. So this is the action of that, the threat value of the next action will give us threat facilitated. And once again, we can look at threat facilitated per 100 combinations for all of these players. And once again, these players are doing really well again. Sergio Busquets is someone who usually invites pressure and then plays onto someone else to create. He's not the main creator necessarily. He will allow other players to create by playing defense splitting passes. And here we can see on the right hand side the same thing under pressure, and now these values are much more sensible in that the XT facilitated under pressure is typically low, so smaller compared to the XT facilitated overall. So this could be an indication that the second possibility I mentioned earlier, that some of the under pressure actions are hit and hope kind, might be true. But once again, it's something that we should investigate later. Next, we look at progression percentage. So this is how close we are getting to the opposition goal due to the actions of these players. And Frankie de Jong is really good at progressing the ball with his carries. Joshua Kimmich and Toni Kroos are some of the most amazing long ball players. Busquets still has those defense splitting pass ability. Pedri is much more of a short combination kind of player, so he doesn't feature that highly up in this graph, but we have the usual suspects doing really well in both these graphs here. The next metric is predictability or unpredictability, which is measured in terms of entropy. So here we have another relative sonar. What exactly is being shown here is the number of passes in different angular bins. So this angular bin has the highest volume of passes, and the whitish ones have comparatively lower volume of passes. So what we do is we divide the number of passes in each bin by the total number of passes. It's not just passes, it's passes and carries. And once we do that, we can use this formula for entropy, which is the fraction in each bin multiplied by the log of that fraction, and then sum over all of the bins. And then this minus sign takes care of the fact that log of number smaller than 1 is negative. So this will overall give us a positive value. And so entropy gives us how varied is the distribution of passes in different bins. So this tells us whether a player tends to turn in a specific way or is going to distribute his passes or movements in different directions under pressure. And so once again, we have the overall unpredictability given by this entropy and measured against the total volume of combinations attempted. Once again, we have all of our highlighted names showing up really high on the entropy metric as well. And then we have the same under pressure, and Frankie de Jong once again is sort of a standout here. All right, so now I pass on to Manas for the last bit of the talk.
Thanks, Soumyajit, and good evening, everyone. Thanks for having us here. I'm just going to talk about a little bit about the expectation model that we built for movement under pressure. And as Soumyajit mentioned in the beginning, it's an extension of the existing expected passes models that have already been built in the community. But here, what we've changed is that we've added carries into the mix, which basically can be interpreted as a number of small passes played to yourself. The next thing that we've interpreted, that we've included, is a lot of the granular data that is available in the StatsBomb event data, like pass height, the type of pass, whether the pass was a switch, whether the pass was an assist, etc. And we've also enhanced the data set by adding 360 data, where we've taken the number of active pressors on the player performing the action. So what that typically is, as you can see in the diagram, where player P1 is performing some action and he is being pressed by 5 opposition players. So anyone within 5 yards of the player performing the action would be counted as a pressor and then added to the model to predict whether the action would be completed or not. So it's essentially just a binary classifier, and we've used the histogram gradient boosting classifier from the scikit-learn library to build this up. So, so if we move on, certain considerations to keep here, keep in mind here, that the data is, you have a really small amount of data. So, so we've had to choose the entire width of the pitch, and we've had to expand the angular distribution, which we talked about in the beginning, to a wider angle. But with more data and more specificity, we can perform zone-specific and angle-restrictive studies. The second is that a lot of actions do get removed when we're trying to perform the tightness calculations, which we'll talk about in a moment, because the 360 data doesn't really capture the player, and they might be at the edge of the visual area. And another consideration that we took was that only passes from regular play, which is a sort of an event data pointer in the data itself, were considered. Nothing apart from that was considered to build this model up. So essentially, this is the output of the model, where we are measuring success under pressure against expected success under pressure. And we've restricted it to players who are forwards or midfielders, not defenders, because defenders generally tend to pass forwards even if they're under pressure or not. So like we talked about, putting the ball long or performing the clearance. So those sort of actions get filtered out. And just looking at the graph, it just seemed to be a little linear, but certain interesting things to point out are the top right corner, the top right grouping is what we refer to as sort of the elite player zone. As you can see, the likes of Toni Kroos, Luka Modric, Sergio Busquets. These guys tend to perform incredibly well under pressure, with or without pressure, as has been quantified by the metrics that we've already talked about. And the central zone distribution usually contains more forwards who tend to perform a little under expectations. So, but an anomaly here would be Karim Benzema, who is performing extremely well under pressure. But if you look at Erling Haaland, he sort of performs under expectation. So if you move on, we have another metric here where we're trying to measure the tightness of the press by basically splitting the pitch into Voronoi cells and measuring the area of the cell that the player is in. So if the area is low, that means the measure of the press is higher. And the risk is measured by basically flipping the expected threat to measure it from the perspective of the pressing players instead of the players who is performing the action. So if we go on, Here's the quantified scatter plot where you can see risk versus tightness, which is essentially talking about the similar metrics that we spoke about in the beginning, where the tightness, if the tightness is low and the pressure is high, so is the risk. The risk might be also be less for the opposition, because if the opposition wins the ball towards the defender in their defensive zone, uh, the tightness might be high in the defensive zone, but if they win the ball, the expected threat for them, for the opposition, is also low. So this is how one way we can interpret this graph. And and the last metric that we have for you is whether the players change the way that they pass when they're under pressure. And as has been the norm, the elite players don't really tend to do that. And how we've quantified this is by using the Jensen-Shannon method, diversion method, where they're basically quantifying the probability distribution of when players pass under pressure and without pressure, to see how much the distribution angles change. And as you can see, the really elite players like Sergio Busquets, Frankie de Jong, the really good players, Toni Kroos, they're really unperturbed by pressure. Yeah. So we can move on. So this essentially brings us to the end of the presentation, more or less. But before we leave you, we have some actionable points where this study or quantification of this sort can be used. For example, where if a player is if the player in spotlight is perhaps arriving late to the pass, he can be trained in coaching to improve his ability under pressure by coaching them to play faster or take fewer touches under pressure, or perhaps lay the ball off quicker to a player near him. And from an opponent's perspective, this study can serve as finding opposition players who have proclivity to pass in a certain direction or turn in a certain direction under pressure, and use that information to really press them and act when the ball arrives to them. Use that as a pressing trigger to go on and win the ball and cause a turnover. And lastly, some future work that can be done once if we have the right body pose data, which we talked about in the beginning, because we've had to sort of proxy what we define as turning with the ball by calculating any angles. But if we have body pose data, it would make the study even more robust and rigorous. And essentially we've used expected threat measurements to build certain metrics, but better models like the OBV by StatsBomb or the EPV model by Javier Fernandez can be used, who use the models which are built already using opposition player information. Would be a natural step in the direction to use to go forward and study these metrics more using those models. And lastly, I think before we leave you, I think we just want to say a big thank you to StatsBomb for providing us with this opportunity and the chance to study this data. And a special mention to Dinesh Bhutwani, who has stayed with us throughout this and helped us build some of these metrics out, and has been a constant source of motivation as well. And this wouldn't be complete without mentioning Andre Rogelson, whose fantastic MPL soccer package built on Python allows us to really build pitches without a lot of effort. And Ricardo Tavares, whose Bird's Eye View app is what we use to build out the Voronoi example. And Robert Hickman, who also helped us with the abstract submission for this project. These are some of the sources that we've mentioned, that we've used and already mentioned. So small shout out to them. for doing incredible work already in the analytics community. And lastly, this wouldn't have been possible without the motivation and discussion of the larger analytics community that's out there. And these are just some of the names who are involved in football analytics. So this wouldn't be complete without them. And yeah, so just a small shout out to all of the names on here. And I think that brings us pretty much to the end of it. So before we leave, I think thank you for attending. Thank you for taking the time to listen to us, and have a nice day.